Hello, I'm Jyotika. Welcome to Excelling Psychology. I've been getting a lot of requests to cover the organization specialization, so today I'll be doing that. Organization has always been very popular. Recently, I've seen a trend that schools will first take up clinical, then they'll keep on debating over which other option they should take, so they'll consider consumer and health, but ultimately they come down to organization. So clinical and organization seems to be a very popular combination. I think that's because schools feel that students are doing business anyways, and a lot of theories which are there in organization are overlapping with business. So they can save some time by taking up organization. Anyways, whatever it is, on my channel you will already find number of videos on clinical psychology, designer study questions, 6 and 10 markers, solving past papers. So you can watch those. Today I'll cover organization. I think I'm covering it for the first time. Here I'm covering the 10 marker which you have to do in paper 1. So what I'm going to do in this video is and take a slightly different approach. And I'm sorry, not paper 1, paper 3. The approach I'm taking is, first I will explain to you the mark scheme criteria for scoring between 9 and 10 marks, like you can see on your screen right now. Like what you need to do to make your answer fall in the level 5 mark band. And then I will solve a paper question that's from May, June, one of the variants which had come on motivation. We'll actually write an answer. So I will write the answer in front of you, and as I'm writing, I will show you how I'm meeting the criteria which are given in the mark scheme. Okay, so I'll just show you the question also. The question was on Maslow's hierarchy and McClelland's theory. Now I know most of you are going to think that this is a really easy one. I've deliberately taken this one because it is in the easy ones, and the ones which students are overconfident about, that they get the least marks and then they keep debating, oh, I had written so much, but why I didn't score, or I knew this really well. The whole aim of my video is that only, that you feel you know lots of things well and you feel you can write a lot about something, but it doesn't help you to get marks unless you meet the requirements of the mark scheme. So with the topic which is very familiar to you, which you know very well, it'll be easy for you to follow this video also. Okay, so let's begin with looking at what are the requirements for scoring 9 or 10 marks, preferably 10 marks on the 10 marker. I will go through only what is given under level 5 because anyways we are not targeting level 1 to 4. We don't want our answer to fall there, so why should we look at that? Okay, so if you see at level 5, the first thing they want in your answer is detailed evaluation. Evaluation means giving strengths and weaknesses. Now what has happened is, in some of my previous videos, I have taken the format of writing or the structure of writing like we take in AS. So I would name an issue like, say, application to everyday life, and I would say one strength of this is whatever and one weakness of this is. So many students came up and asked me, like, do we have to phrase our answers that way? Do we have to write strengths and weaknesses for every issue and debate? Yes, you do, because you can see the very first criterion which is given here is detailed evaluation. And what does it mean to evaluate something? To give strengths and weaknesses. You might not explicitly use the word strength or the word weakness, and I can understand that. Your style of writing can be different. But at least there has to be an implication of what is the strength or weakness of something when you're writing. Let's say, for example, we are going to take Maslow. So let's take another example right now. Let's say we are taking one of the leadership theories. So say we are taking the universalist theory of leadership. And we want to say that it is reductionist because it attributes leadership to inborn characteristics like charisma of a leader. So when we want to say it's reductionist, if I just say this is the reason why it is reductionist, I am not implying any strength or weakness of it. So it's more descriptive in nature than evaluative. And they've asked for evaluation, then how will you score on that criterion? So even if you don't explicitly use wording like strength or weakness, it has to be there in your answer. Your answer cannot simply be descriptive, like I said. So when we're writing the answer, you will understand better when we write the answer for the Maslow question. Very importantly, this time in the May June, I've picked up the requirements from the May June mark scheme. They've gone out of their way to mention that it needs to be contextualized throughout, because this is one habit students have consistently in AS and then in A also, that they will keep on writing strengths and weaknesses without reference to the theory or the studies which are being discussed. So, for example, they would say that if a theory is reductionist, then it is a very limited explanation of behavior. But they will not point out how leadership theory is reductionist, what element of that particular theory is very simplistic, and why that theory cannot be applied. So they'll keep on talking generally, what we call generic answers. That's why they have really emphasized that you need to contextualize throughout. Means whatever you're talking about, whichever theory or study, every evaluative point that you make, every strength or weakness which you suggest, has to be with reference to that theory or study, not generally. They don't want to know generally what's the problem of reductionism or determinism or application. They want to know with respect to that theory. So keep it in mind, none of your points in the answer should be generic in nature. You're not going to get high marks for those. The next you can see in the criterion requirement is analysis needs to be evident throughout. It can be difficult to distinguish between analysis and evaluation. Analysis just means breaking down something into components or elements and then linking those components or elements to the point made. A simple way of thinking about this is you need to give finer points from the theory or study which you have learned and link them to the issues which you are discussing. So you just don't keep on saying overall Maslow's theory or universalist theory or McClellan theory is reductionist. Exactly what about it is reductionist? Which aspect of it is reductionist? So you really break down to, okay, this thing which is mentioned in the theory or this thing which is mentioned in the study is reductionist, or it is, say, based on free will, or it supports nature, whatever point you're making. Here, I want you to note that even if overall, say some theory is reductionist, everything about it is reductionist, fine, but then at least you can give some examples. So you can say, okay, overall it is a reductionist theory, and for example, this part of it is reductionist, and etc. Means even you're trying to indicate the whole of it is reductionist, this is just one example of it. This is an analysis where you really become explicit about the theory. Concrete examples, concrete points from what you've learned in the theory, you need to break down and you need to match with the issues and debates that you're giving. Many times students just learn summaries of theories, they just learn summaries of studies. That approach is good. You don't need to know every study in detail, otherwise there wouldn't be a differentiation between key studies and those example studies which are there in the syllabus. So the approach is right. But what I'm trying to say is they would learn the summaries in such a way that it's just an overview. Like even summary, they don't learn in the proper format. If I'm learning the summary of a theory, say I'm learning the summary of Maslow, I can't just say, okay, there are 5 needs and that's it. It can't be as brief as that. Which are the 5 needs? At least I should know the names and an example of each. If I'm talking about universalist theory and I want a summary, leadership theory, it cannot just be, okay, leaders are born and not made. Only one line I know about it. I don't know what they mean by leaders are born, with what qualities they are born. I don't know the names of those qualities. What I'm trying to suggest is, of course, you cannot know a theory in its entirety, or you cannot know a study word to word, especially the key studies you have to know. The sample studies you cannot know word to word. So, of course, they're too extensive for you to know fully. But in the summary also, you have to know the key aspects of the theory and in a fair amount of detail, such that you should be able to provide analysis. Otherwise, you will fail in analysis. Your answer will go in the lower mark band. Because just now what we saw about analysis, you should be able to link specific parts of the theory or study to the points that you're making. How will you do that if you don't know the theory or the study in enough detail? So make sure this links to your learning, how you should learn, how you should prepare for the paper. When you're learning, know the key points about the theory. There are very good books for that. Of course, first you should learn from the textbook, and then you should revise from the revision guide, which is available by Hodder. Strictly stay away or avoid notes on the internet, quick fix notes, last minute revision, flashcards which are like one word on one side and one word on the other side and no detail. Keep away from such things because they won't help you in analysis. They might not even help you in barely passing the paper. Okay, the next criterion you can see is a good range of issues, including the named issue. Now, this is very subjective. They have not really fixed the criterion and given you a specific like these many issues you need to cover in the answer. But if we see year after year, like right from the older syllabus we are seeing till date, a minimum and I would say even a maximum of 3 issues is good to be discussed. I would cap it at 3 issues, and I feel less than that also, unless you're very detailed and you give really brilliant points about what you're writing. I feel less than that becomes a little less. So I would say the ideal number of issues you should cover is 3, and this is inclusive of the named issue, which is given in the 10 marker. So 1 named issue plus 2 additional issues of your own. What is happening is, for some of the textbook, like the way they've released the answers or the revision guide answers which are there, or even some teachers are teaching that way, I understand the approaches of taking a breadth of issues and showing that we can talk about 5 or 6 issues on one topic. They are not discouraging you from taking that approach. You can. So say you're discussing Maslow's and McClelland's theory, and you want to discuss 5 issues in total, including the named one. Of course, you're free to do that. But you tend to compromise depth for breadth. Means inevitably it will happen. If you're taking 5 issues, will you be able to detail each one of them enough in the given time which you have? You have to write 2 10 markers in paper 1. One for this option and one for the other, which mostly is going to be clinical. So then how will you do both of it? So I feel taking up 3 issues and taking a depth approach, that is writing in detail about each, is better than taking 5 or 6 and then just touching upon them and not detailing on any, because there's a danger. Unless you're a very good writer, evaluation and analysis will be compromised. When you're giving breadth of issues, the tendency is just to name it, okay, this is deterministic, that one is free will, finished, because I need to write about 4 more issues, so I'm very concerned about that. So I don't elaborate on what I mentioned, then it becomes a very generic answer. So my suggestion would be take 3 issues in all and elaborate them in depth. Next requirement is that selection of evidence has to be very thorough and effective. Here most students get concerned that, does evidence mean research evidence? Like for every theory, every point that I make, do I have to give some research study to support it? No, that is not what they mean by evidence. By evidence here they mean is any concepts from the theory, any examples from the theory, research evidence also. If you know about any research which is supporting, you can include that. If it's a study, evidence in the sense any fact from the study which you can use to support your answer. Actually, this is just another way of saying that you need to contextualize your answer. Like I told you, this time they've really specified that you need to contextualize. Otherwise, it's another way of saying that today, that you need to give evidence. They've just made it more prominent by in the beginning also saying contextualization. Here again, they are trying to emphasize that your answers should not be limited. They should not be like you're just going on talking about something but you're not relating it to the theory. So you're just giving general points and there's no evidence from the theory or study to support it. That's what they mean. And when they say thorough and effective, what they mean by that is, just a minute, something is stuck here. Okay, when they say your evidence needs to be thorough, I can give you the example of Maslow right now. Even while writing, I will show it to you. Many students don't thoroughly cover what is given in the syllabus for a theory. Like if you see Maslow's study, there is a study in that about how the theory has been used to develop a basic need satisfaction scale for children. That's Sydnia's study, which is there. Now, many students forget that that study is there within the topic. Because of that, what happens is they are not covering entirely what is given in the syllabus. They have given you Maslow's theory. Within that, they have given you Seidmeyer's study. Only when you cover that theory plus the study, you're being thorough. Otherwise, you're leaving out something which is there in the syllabus. Not only that, some students can go to the extent that if two things are asked about in the question, like we saw, they have asked McClelland and Maslow, they just cover one. Like they have learned very well about the evaluation points for Maslow, not for McClelland, so they don't cover. Again, your one more thing is within McClelland's theory, you also have TAT, how that is used for measuring the needs. That is also given. So again, if you want to be thorough, you need to cover TAT as well. You can't forget what all is included within a topic in the syllabus. And like I mentioned before, here also the same thing applies. Why many students will forget what is there within the topic? Because they just take broad overviews of every topic. They don't even try to learn summaries with key points. So that's why, oh, I know Maslow's theory. I've done it in business. McClelland's theory I've done in business. I'm not going to even read what is given in the psychology textbook. That approach is not helping you because you're required to be thorough. And then you don't even know that which study is there under Maslow and which is there under McClelland. So being thorough means covering all the topics which are there, even for evaluation, not only in the 6 marker, in the 10 marker also. And use those studies and that test TAT which is given to make points in the answer, to make evaluative and analytical points in the answer. So not only include them in your 10 marker, include them where they are relevant and evaluate and analyze them as well. That is when you're being thorough. And effective means to illustrate your points. Of course, you can't just use anything from the theory. It has to be relevant to what you're writing. Let's say if I'm taking, let's say goal setting theories, then motivation, right? After these need theories, there are cognitive theories. So supposing I'm taking goal setting theory. Now there students don't learn properly which are the 5 requirements for setting a specific goal. And then because of that, they will just give any example which is not relevant to the point they're making. I'll just tell you, for example, they'll say goals need to be time bound. And then for an example of that how goals can be time bound, they would say that instead of saying that I want to make sales, I should say I need to make 10% sales. When you're saying that sales need to be 10%, you are specifying the goal. You're making it specific. Are you making it time bound? Are you stating what duration is required to meet that goal? No. So that is not considered as effective evidence because the point is something else and the evidence which you're giving is something else. So when it needs to be effective means it needs to be relevant and it needs to make your point clear, which it can do only when it is relevant. And that's why they've specified, like I mentioned, some students will cover only Maslow, only McClelland because they know that well. The other one they won't even touch upon, or they'll just cover it in the 6 marker. In the 10 marker, they feel evaluation we can give from anyone. They have clearly mentioned that evaluation you must give from both concepts, both theories. This table which is there, it is for the 10 marker only. It's not for the 6 marker. And in that they are telling you, you must cover both theories or both concepts. So theories, studies, whatever is there, if 2 are asked for. 1, this tells you that maximum they're going to ask you for 2 theories or 2 concepts in the paper. That's why they've mentioned it like this. 2, it tells you that not only for the 6 marker, even for the 10 marker, you must cover both. So quickly, I'll just summarize now what we are learning from this mark scheme, that what all we need to cover, like what our answer should be like. We should cover in terms of range of issues, in my opinion, 3 issues or debates, minimum and maximum. So we should target 3. Of course, it's up to you. I'm not giving you any hard or fast rule. Everyone has their own writing style. Yours might be a little different. So you can follow that. Secondly, in every issue that you're covering, just make 3 separate paragraphs. Practical tip, 3 separate paragraphs for each issue and debate. In AS, how you used to organize it? By 2 strengths, 2 weaknesses. That was the requirement. This time, just organize your paragraph by the issues or debates which you're taking. So for every paragraph, that is every issue or debate you're taking, make sure you're giving strengths and weaknesses, even if not explicitly, imply what are the strengths or weaknesses of the issue or the debate which you have named for this particular theory or study. Make sure analysis is there. Make sure that you are taking specific parts of the theory or the study and linking it to the point which you're making, the issue or debate which you've taken up. And make sure you're covering all the concepts, all the studies, sample studies, whatever is given under that theory, any test is given, you're covering that at least in one of the paragraphs. You don't have to include it in every point. So let's say you are covering Maslow's theory and Seidner study. We are not saying in every paragraph that you're evaluating Maslow, you have to only give a point from Seidner. But somewhere it needs to be there. It cannot be totally missing from your answer. So at least in one of the points you cover that. And of course, give points which are relevant. Know the aspects of the study fully so that you can apply some relevant aspect of the study to the point you're making, and not just whatever is coming to your mind about the theory, try to justify it anyway, like try to fit it anyway. That should not be the approach. So this is what we mean by smart work. Smart work in psychology for the evaluation questions means that you know what the mark scheme is, you know how to get a level 5 answer, and you prepare your answers accordingly. Of course, hard work is needed. It is not that you can just know this and now you'll be able to write good answers, because for analysis and all you'll have to learn the theories and all properly. But first you learn how to write according to the mark scheme, then do your hard work, then learn all the textbook content and revise properly, and then prepare your answers. Okay, so now like I told you, this is a May-June 24 question, the latest one. And I've taken up because students will tell me they know very well about Maslow and McClelland's theory. So as we write the answer together, just think about it. Be honest with yourself. You don't have to tell anyone else. Did you know that you have to write the answer like this? Would you be writing the answer like this? If not, buck up. Start writing your answers. Don't take things for granted. Because especially for organization, students have this attitude, oh, I've done it in business, I don't need to prepare. So be honest with yourself, and when you're seeing the answer, write it with me and think, would you have been able to write like this if you would have not studied from the psychology textbook? If not, open that book and start learning properly. Okay, now practically I'll give you tips as we keep writing, plus I will keep on showing you how we are meeting the requirements which we have just discussed. Like I told you, we should organize the answer into 3 paragraphs. No need for any introduction or conclusion. Those are not going to be credited, so why waste our time? We have too much to write in the paper. Straight off, we'll begin with the first issue which we are discussing. One thing is, unlike last year, I will not begin with one strength or one weakness, because I intend to show preferably both sides of the issue or debate. So let me name the issue in the beginning, which I'm going to discuss. Also here, this brings me to one more point. Many students will ask, do I have to give strengths and weaknesses for every issue? No, you do not have to. Don't keep any compulsion of yourself that for every issue I must give strength also and weakness also. But when you read your final answer, when you have gone through all the 3 issues and debates, just check, is your answer leaning on one side? Like you've only spoken about strengths of Maslow and McClelland and you've not given weaknesses in any of the paragraphs. Or you have only given weaknesses, you've only kept on criticizing the theories and you've never spoken about a strength. That is an imbalanced answer. Not that you cannot write it, but preferably try to take a balanced perspective, at least to some extent. So it applies to the whole answer, not to individual issues. Overall, there should be strengths and weaknesses. That's why it's so important to prepare your answers also, because this is not what you should be thinking about in the exam. It's really going to slow you down. When you have your answers prepared, you won't have to think about these things. And as you keep practicing your answers, it becomes spontaneous. You don't have to think about it. Naturally, your answers will start coming out that way. Preferably begin with the named issue which is given. Here the named issue is determinism versus free will. So we will begin with that one. You can keep it for later. Whatever I'm giving you are suggestions, or ideally how you should write the answer. Your writing style can differ a little and still you can score full marks. There's no issue as long as you're meeting the requirements of the mark scheme. So how we can begin, like a good opening for any paragraph is, one relevant issue to the neat theories of motivation is determinism versus free will. Okay, let me take the theories one by one. My personal preference is, again, not a strict requirement, but for every issue or debate that I take up, I like to cover both the theories which are there. You can have an approach where you take up only one theory for one issue, another theory for another issue. Overall, it should be balanced. Like we saw, overall, you have to be thorough and you have to make sure you touch upon all the concepts or theories given in the syllabus. But I just like to take both together because it helps me to show my evaluative ability. Like when I take determinism versus free will, if I can contrast Maslow and McClelland, and I can show which is more deterministic or which is based on more free will, that's a type of evaluation that I'm doing by comparing the two. So this one is more deterministic. So these are the implications. Compared to that, that theory is less deterministic. So these are the implications. Just makes for better evaluation and shows my critical thinking better. That on the same issue, I'm able to take two types of need theories and able to see where they stand with respect to each other. Again, it's a matter of preference. Okay, so what I would say is Maslow's theory is highly deterministic. Now, this is where students start making mistakes. They just leave it at this. Maslow's theory is highly deterministic, full stop. Why is it deterministic? More importantly, what about it is deterministic? Specifically, what is deterministic? That is how you do analysis. Yes, overall the theory is deterministic, but can you pinpoint to that particular element, which is why we call it deterministic? That will show your analytical ability. So why am I saying it's deterministic? Because of every point I make should be justified. Automatically it becomes analysis. The strict hierarchy in which needs are presented. Okay, so what exactly is deterministic about it? The strict hierarchy. I have analyzed the theory. Now, the thing about Maslow and McClelland's theory, when I discuss in class also, I always mention it's not meant only for the workplace. These are general need theories of motivation. And motivation, though it's most relevant to the workplace, it's found in everyday life also. So the theory is not written in a way that it's applicable only to the workplace. So we don't have workplace specific needs or examples. We should give workplace specific examples when we are discussing the point, because after all, we are writing an answer for organizational psychology. So if I'm just talking generally about Maslow's theory, not making it relevant to organization, I'm not really showing what I've learned about the theory which is relevant to the workplace. That is important. And that will make for good evidence, also effective evidence like we saw. And in that I had mentioned that giving examples is a good form of evidence. So effective evidence in organization can be examples that apply to the workplace. Okay, now I've just made a point that Maslow's theory is deterministic because of the order. Let me just explain a little more, to be a little more analytical. What is the problem with that? What if it's in order? How is it making it deterministic? So it assumes that basic physiological needs must be satisfied before higher order psychosocial needs can be pursued. Now this is a true point, it's an analytical point, but how is it relevant to the workplace? So that let me show with the help of an example. For example, an employee who is struggling to meet his basic needs for survival, such as food and shelter, must first focus on acquiring decent wages from the job before thinking of socializing with colleagues or seeking promotion. So we've learned basic needs are food, clothing, shelter, and higher order needs are respect, esteem, and socialization, that's belongingness. So I've given examples from there, but which are relevant to an employee, to the workplace. So here I'm showing that according to Maslow, it is compulsory to meet those lower order needs, and unless those are met, a person cannot move higher. So what this means is the employee is bound to satisfy needs in the way proposed by the hierarchy. The employee does not have any free will to decide which need he would like to pursue. He will only have to take the one which is next on the hierarchy. So this is the implication, and this will make for evaluation. When I point out that free will is not being considered, that is where I'm going to show that this is like a weakness. I won't say explicitly it's a weakness, but that is what I'm implying. And to make it further prominent, like how it's a weakness, I will give an example to show that this is not always the case. People do use their free will very often. Last time I have taken the approach in clinical to talk about like one strength, one weakness, and like I told you, many students got confused because of that. Do we have to only write that way? That's why this time I'm not mentioning the word strengths and weaknesses, but I'm showing you how these things are implied in the answer. Many times when you read in the textbook, though the Hodder textbook is very well organized, but many times they don't use words like strengths and weaknesses directly, especially when they're giving examples. Now that you see this writing style, you will be able to understand that even if they don't use those words, they have mentioned them in the points given. Okay, so I will say this ignores the role of free will. That is, the employee's decision to pursue needs of their choice. For example, examples are a really good way of, clarifying your points. Like I told you, makes it relevant to the workplace also. It's the best way of explaining something. So always make a habit of including a lot of examples to be very, very clear about what you're talking. So for example, many artists and painters, social workers, social activists, we can say, these also types of employees, like they might not be affiliated to an organization, but they are working in the art field, or they are working for social causes. We can say seek to self-actualize, that is, use their creativity fully, or do the most they can for people, even when they do not have enough financial stability. So here the example that I'm giving is that many times people do not have their basic or physiological needs met, and yet they are struggling for higher order needs because that's their choice. They are willing to ignore the lower order need, the fact that they are still hungry, so that they can pursue what is more important to them, which is their psychological need of self-actualization to reach their full potential. So here you can see that I have not said that it's a weakness, like I've not used the word weakness of Maslow's theory that free will is not being supported, but I've implied that by saying that free will also counts in the real world, and that's not been looked into in the theory. So how I have analyzed, I just want to, because we are learning it for the first time for organization, how have I analyzed this answer? By talking about specific elements of the theory, like the strict hierarchy. In the examples also, specific needs of survival, self-actualization, belongingness, those needs I have given in maybe in different words, but specific things I have taken up from the theory. And I have evaluated also by suggesting what is a problem with this, how this is a weakness. If instead I want to take a strength, I can take that also. See, I have very limited time when I'm writing in the paper, so I can't take everything possible for both theories. But if instead you want to take it as a strength of Maslow's theory that it's deterministic, just remember always the strength of determinism is it makes behavior predictable. So in that sense, the theory is very useful to the organization, because once behavior is predictable, organizations know, okay, if survival needs are met, then employees will be looking for safety. So then the organization knows first we need to give bare minimum wages to the employees. Once that is done, we should think about policies of insurance, contracts, bonds with the employees, so that they feel that their job is secure. Once that is met, then they need to make some provisions for socialization of employees, such as they can create some informal groups where they can meet each other, or they can organize festivals or celebrations in the organizations occasionally. So the strength of determinism is that behavior of employees becomes predictable, and then the organization can formulate policies on exactly how to motivate them from one step to the next. So that is what you can give as a strength if you want to. Like I said, it's not possible to take every point for every theory. There's always a strength, like a good side of something, and a weakness, a bad side of something. But that's too much to write about. So you can decide, in your view, what is more important. You can talk about that. So I felt the fact that it ignores free will is something I would like to discuss here. Okay, now talking about McClelland's theory, I should not write it in isolation. Evaluation has to be inherent. So I should draw on it from where I have left Maslow's theory. Why not compare the two? I always tell this to students, a very good way of scoring in the paper is drawing comparisons across different theories that you've learned. Sometimes those theories are not asked about also. Like here, I'm not going to take the point, but supposing if I was taking reductionism, I would say that Maslow's theory and McClelland's theory is reductionist because they only focus on needs. They don't focus on other things which can motivate employees, such as goal setting or such as employees' perceptions of the organization, like we see in Room's theory of VIE. So then I could talk about, in this answer only, a little bit about goal setting theory by Locke and Latham or Room's expectancy theory, just to illustrate my point. So one really good way of scoring which examiners really appreciate is if you can draw upon different theories which you've learned, you can contrast them, you can show similarities, that you can compare them. It really helps you to score well. And another thing which really helps you to score well is taking a balanced perspective, which does not have to be for every point, but ultimately it has to be there in your answer. Okay, so now to compare with McClelland's theory, I would say in contrast, McClelland's theory is less deterministic to an extent. It's not entirely like based on free will, so I cannot say it's based on free will and like directly contrast it with Maslow's theory. But yes, it is less deterministic. Again, same approach, I need to justify why I'm saying that. So drawing on specific elements of the theory, I will show why it is less deterministic. It suggests that though everyone has the need for affiliation, achievement, and power, how much of these needs an individual has is shaped by their life experiences and culture. Okay, so this is to the extent it is deterministic. Like I'm saying, it's not fully free will, it's less deterministic. So because culture and experiences are shaping or determining what needs they have. So to that extent, it's deterministic. But what is free will? What is supporting free will in this theory? However, there is no strict hierarchical order in which the needs have to be pursued, which suggests that individuals are free to exercise the needs, to try to satisfy the need of their choice over other needs. Okay, and again, this does not make it relevant to the workplace. So I'll give an example to make it relevant, because again, it's general and it can be applied anywhere. That a person makes a choice, supposing I want to pursue power over achievement. I want to achieve affiliation. So I want to pursue affiliation over achievement. So that becomes, like I said, very, generic. To make it specific to the workplace, again, I'll talk about how this applies to employees. So for example, an employee might choose to seek better projects and better pay in the workplace to feel a sense of achievement, rather than seeking leadership positions to exercise power. Now, I know the very moment that I complete this paragraph, there will be comments on this is too long and how are we going to write this in the paper? Because many students, no matter how much we discourage this, they are only preoccupied about the wording, the length. They are not really trying to follow what is happening. So much of advice, so many suggestions are there in the video, how to improve your answer, but their attention is there. Length is too much, this much word timing, always on the superficialities. I know this sounds critical, but you need to hear some harsh feedback from time to time so that you can improve. Stop being preoccupied with the length is so much and the words are so much and how will I meet the time. Try to get good advice from the video which will help you to score well. Don't keep focusing always on things, typical, stereotypical things, and being concerned about things which actually take away your attention from what is more important. Are you understanding how I'm structuring the answer? Are you understanding how I'm choosing to put down the content? Are you understanding how I'm meeting the requirements of the mark scheme? When you think like that, you score high in the paper. That's the difference between a high scoring student and a low scoring student. The low scoring student is always busy thinking about time, word, how much I'll have to learn, how will I write so much. In many of my videos, I have explained this. I'm reiterating here also. When I write an answer, because I'm showing you something, I'm demonstrating, I'm explaining to you something, it's bound to be longer than what you are going to write because I'm making everything so explicit about the answer. So I'm explaining to you about the mark schemes, how we are meeting the requirement. That's why I'm really taking baby steps, writing down one thing so that you can understand what is required to be done. So if you take away, you keep aside the fact that it is looking long and it is becoming this and that, you will be able to take away good things from the video. As long as you're preoccupied with those things and you're thinking about commenting on those things, you're not going to take away anything from the class and it's going to be your loss only. Okay, so keep your mind, keep your focus on the right place when you're learning something. Like I told you, it will sound harsh, but I'm saying this for your good. When you comment things like that, I can easily ignore. I can even delete it. It just doesn't take a second. But I am concerned and I want you to learn something. And for that, you need to change your attitude in the first place. Okay, so when it comes to an answer like this, where one paragraph is very long, like I said, when you write down, of course, you're not memorizing this and writing. So what you're going to write down is going to be briefer. Secondly, even if you look at examiner release documents, from time to time they release support material, which you must have also seen, your schools must have shown you. What are high scoring answers, low scoring answers? There's definitely a correlation between length and marks given to the answer. There's no denying that. Because in a lengthy answer, only you're able to cover everything. Evidence, evaluation, analysis. I'm not saying it needs to be as lengthy as I've written here. But assuming that, oh, I'll just write 2-3 lines for one issue, 2-3 lines for another, and 2-3 for the last one. So I'll just write 9 to 10 sentences and I'll get 10 marks. That is a very unrealistic explanation. So don't assume things to be easier than they are. Your loss is there in that. And that's one reason why so many students, oh, I wrote for an A. How did I get a D? How did I get an E? Like I told you, be honest to yourself. Now when you're seeing the answer, are you realizing why you're getting D's and E's instead of getting A? Only if you're able to see that will you be able to improve. Till you remain blind to what you need to cover and till you keep on denying that no, this is not required, it's much easier than this is unnecessarily lengthy, I don't need to write. Till you remain in that sort of denial, you're going to be sticking with your D's and E's and you won't be able to come up to an A. Okay, so we've covered one issue and debate. Let's move towards the next one because totally we are going to be covering 3. Okay, so for the next issue, I would like to take up validity. That will also help me to cover the TAT, which is within McClelland's theory, and the Sydney study, which is under Maslow's theory. Again, I will organize it as per the issue I'm taking up. So I will begin this paragraph by saying another relevant issue is that of validity. Now, if we think about Maslow's theory, within that there is the Sydney study, and that is found to be a very valid study because it has brought about a valid means for measurement of Maslow's theory. So, what we can say is Maslow's theory has often been criticized for lacking validity in its empirical evidence, since it has been supported by qualitative studies. To overcome the problem of measuring needs and motivation qualitatively, Sydney conducted a study to develop a questionnaire that could measure basic needs satisfaction in children. Okay, now this is the point that I'm making about the issue. Now I have mentioned validity. So for analysis, I need to specify what about the study makes it valid. Like I mentioned before, we need to be as specific as possible. So with the help of interviews of a sample of children and their parents, the researchers developed the basic needs satisfaction scale BNSS, which is a quantitative measure of needs in children. I would just add to that Maslow's needs in children. This scale was then piloted on a large group of children, and it was found to have a reliability of 0.83, suggesting that it is a highly valid tool for measurement of needs. Unfortunately, in the syllabus itself, they have given a study which applies to children. It does not have direct bearing to the workplace. So here I do not have any example to link it with the workplace as such. If we want, we can give an example that, similar measures can be made for the workplace as well. Definitely. But right now, I feel that I would just like to move on to McClelland's theory because I have justified the point already. I don't need to add anything more. I have done analysis, like I told you, by specifying exactly what about Sydney's research makes it valid. I have also done evaluation by suggesting that earlier there was qualitative data and that was not appropriate for validity. Today there is quantitative data with a scale having a very high reliability. So that has increased the validity of measurement of Maslow's needs. So again, I've not written specifically that this is a strength, that today validity is there in measurement, but it is implied. It is very evident from what I have written. So evaluation is there, analysis is there. Evidence, I have used Sydney's study finally in the answer to be thorough and effective. Also, one question which will come up is, do we have to give the exact reliability coefficient? No, you can also just say that it has a very high reliability. That's fine. I just remembered the coefficient, so I've written. At the end of the course as a student, when you learn so many studies and you have to remember a lot of figures, I understand that it can be difficult to write down each figure. So if you remember it well and good, just like me, you can write it down. If you do not, you can just indicate the coefficient is found to be high. Now, drawing to McClelland's theory, we have the TAT within that, and that can be criticized. So that I would take in terms of evaluation as a weakness. On the other hand, McClellan's theory is still most popularly subject to measurement of needs using projective methods like the TAT test. Again, if I just leave it at this, which many students will do, they'll just say TAT is not a very valid measure, or they'll just say it's projective. That's not sufficient. It doesn't make for analysis. What about the TAT reduces its validity? Okay, so we can just write that such measures are not very valid because they involve subjective interpretation of stories narrated by participants in response to the stimuli shown. To discover which of McClellan's needs are dominant in the respondent. Okay, so I have mentioned things like participants have to say stories and they need to be subjectively interpreted, and that is what reduces validity. So that is how we write the point with analysis. I just remembered one more thing. I have put up the answer on the screen, but I know for better reading you'd like to have a copy of the answer with you, and preferably you read that answer, you keep the copy in front of you as you're watching this video. So I will upload a copy of the answer once I'm done with it on my website, and you can download it from there. The link will be available in the description box below and in the pinned comment, and then you can keep it alongside as you watch the video. Okay, I think that is sufficient for validity. Again, analysis, evaluation, comparison of both the theories with respect to validity makes for a level 5 type of a response. Finally, I would like to take the issue of cultural differences. That is also very relevant when it comes to the need theories. So yet another relevant issue. Now my structure I'm not explaining over and over again, it's the same for all the paragraphs. Is that of cultural differences. Maslow's theory has been criticized for focusing heavily on individual needs since it has been developed in the individualistic Western society. As we know, Maslow's theory has been developed in the USA, and that is an individualistic culture. So Maslow's focus has also been on individual needs. Again, for analysis and to make it specific, for example, in Western society, self-actualization, so I'm just taking one of the needs as an example, is considered to be fulfilled or met when one has achieved one's own best potential. However, in the non-Western society, like Asian collectivist societies, self-actualization can mean fulfilling what is best for one's family, kin, or the larger society. So you have given a concrete example of why we can say it is biased towards Western values, If I just say it's biased towards the West because it's been developed there, that does not convey anything. Just because something is developed in the West does not mean that it is automatically not applicable to collectivist cultures. Exactly what about it might not be applicable, I need to point out that. So that I've done with the help of a specific needs example. Also here, just like I'm adding a point just because it uplifts the answer more, like I'm able to show more of my knowledge. This is not compulsory, this is optional because in many textbooks it's not covered, but if you've learned about it you can write it. Just makes the point more concrete, like provides better evidence that actually Maslow has acknowledged this. So this is not just speculation that it might not apply to collectivist cultures for these reasons. Actually this has been proved. That's why I'm including this point. Maslow himself later revised his hierarchy to include the need of transcendence at the topmost level, to suggest that doing something for the society beyond oneself can in fact be the highest need to be satisfied in human motivation. Okay, so this suggests that actually even Maslow realized that there are collective needs as well, and that's why he had to revise his hierarchy. Now, coming to McClelland's theory when it comes to cultural differences, again, similar problems are that has been developed in the West. So, I would suggest even McClelland's theory does not always have to be that, I have to contrast only both the theories. So, but in contrast that, if there's something similar, I can point out that as well. Here it shows how I'm able to draw similarities between two theories that also makes for good evaluation and analysis. Okay, so even McClelland's theory has been developed in the West, which is why it is also focused on individual needs for affiliation, achievement, and power. To take an example from this theory, in the West, it might be useful. It might be a useful motivator to pursue one's personal achievements, such as promotions and better pay packages. But in collectivist cultures, it might be more useful to motivate employees using, to motivate employees through collective achievements like listen, sorry, something's coming to my mind. Yeah, like say insurance coverage for the family, or offering holiday packages for the family, or helping someone to what do we say, acquire jobs for their family, like reserve some positions in the organization for their family, that they might consider as an achievement. So we can say reserving job positions for one's family, or achieving as bonus holiday packages or other perks for their family, etc. Like I said, there's no introduction or conclusion required, so I would terminate the answer here. Now, to take a a broader view, like overview of the answer, you can see that overall the answer is balanced. It has both strengths and weaknesses. Like that is one concern which we are having at the end of the answer. So there are points which I have pointed out. Strengths of like McClelland's theory is more leaned towards free will, but it's deterministic to some extent. So it is more balanced in terms of determinism versus free will. And generally, free will is considered to be a strength of any theory. So that is what we are finding in McClelland. Also, when it comes to Maslow's theory, in the next validity, I have pointed out how Sydney study has improved validity for Maslow's theory's measurement. Then in terms of weaknesses, there are lots of weaknesses which I have covered. You can see it's not an even distribution of strengths and weaknesses. Cultural differences has been all about weaknesses, like how it is having ethnocentric bias, basically both the theories. TAT I have given as a weakness of validity because it is a projective measurement subject to interpretation. And in the first paragraph, I have given a criticism of Maslow's theory for being too deterministic. So there are both strengths and weaknesses in my overall answer, though they are not equally balanced, which is perfectly fine. So I hope with the help of this answer and the thought process which I have shown throughout as I'm writing and shown you how we are making sure we are meeting the requirements of the mark scheme, this has been helpful to you. This video is long anyways because it's thorough. So I've not taken the 6 marker part in this, but I assume 6 markers should be easier for you because it's mainly based on description. If you would like me to cover the 6 marker part as well or some other topic, some other type of question, you can leave comments in the description box. There are a lot of type of questions which I've covered already, maybe in different options, but 2 markers, 4, 6 markers, even designer study questions for paper 2. Paper 4, I'm sorry. I've covered those type of things. So you can browse through my channel to see already if there are videos which you want to see. Any other feedback or comments which you have or any questions regarding the video, please leave them in the comment box below. Otherwise, I will not respond. The personal contact which I share of mine is for if you want to schedule classes with me or if you want tuition from me, I provide tuitions. Only for that purposes you can contact me on my number or email ID. If you're going to personally contact me to give any comments about the video, I will not be responding. So if you want an answer to your comment, you'll have to leave it in the box below. That's it from my side in this video, and I will see you soon with another video on this channel. Thank you for watching. Bye.